Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on redefining certification on the voluntary carbon markets. My name is Thibaut Soret. I'm your host and co-founder and CEO of ERS. Before we dive in, I want to extend a warm welcome to our fantastic speakers. Our first guest is Naomi Swickart. Naomi is a lead technical advisor for carbon removals at Integrity Global Partners. Our second guest is Ellen Laurie. Ellen, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much, Thibaut. It's great to be here. I'm Ellen Laurie, and I'm the Director of Natural Climate Solutions and Aviation at AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association.
Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited for the conversation ahead. This webinar is going to have three parts. First, we'll cover some updates from ERS. Then we'll dive into some hot topics with our guests to give some context for this new standard. And finally, if we have time, we'll answer some of your questions during an open Q&A. For everybody watching, please put your answers in the chat at any point during the webinar. Our team will sort through them, compile them, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end of this webinar. On to part one, introduction and updates from ERS. For those of you who don't know us, ERS is a new standard that certifies ecosystem restoration projects on the voluntary carbon markets. Our first methodology covers inland forest restoration projects of all sizes, including landscape scale projects. We assess projects across three key pillars: ecological recovery, carbon, and livelihood. These are not optional co-benefits. Every project must pass a high bar on each of the pillars in order to be certified. Finally, our standard is built to align with the main accreditations on the market: ICVCM, CORSIA, and ECRA. To better understand what we bring to the market, I'd like to highlight three things that set us apart. First, we process applications in 6 months or less, so that projects can focus on what matters most: delivering impact on the ground. The second thing we do is that we monitor projects on an ongoing basis. Beyond traditional third-party audits by independent experts, we use next-generation digital MRV, from satellite imagery to timestamp geolocated data on the ground, to make sure that projects stay on track. Third, we believe that climate finance should reach the ground. That's why we've established rules to ensure that project budgets and revenue shares are publicly disclosed on our registry. By mandating transparency, our standard incentivizes more equitable benefit sharing. For the past 2 years, we've been working under the radar, building this standard. We started in 2020 doing R&D with the European and French space agencies on the use of remote sensing to monitor forest ecosystems. In 2022, we ran pilot projects to ground test a pilot methodology with projects on 2 continents. They went well, and it allowed us to raise some seed financing from top-tier investors. Earlier this year, in March 2023, after 2 private consultations, we launched a public consultation that garnered more than 500 registrations. And we're now finalizing the standard, integrating all of that feedback and making sure it's in line with the ICVCM, CORSIA, and ECRA requirements. At the end of this year, we'll be publishing the standard, and in early 2024, we'll be certifying our first project and announcing a large coalition to send a strong demand signal to the market. Before we get started with our roundtable discussion, we'd like to give everyone a quick update on the changes that we've made since the public consultation. First thing you'll notice, we're down to 3 pillars from 4 earlier, because we've combined the biodiversity pillar with the ecosystem recovery pillar, now renamed the ecological recovery pillar. This first pillar is absolutely crucial. These are not just reforestation projects. They're not afforestation projects. They're projects designed to restore ecosystems back to a high level of ecological recovery. To do so, project developers use reference ecosystems to understand and inform what the restoration plan might be. They then adapt that restoration plan to local conditions and to the local state of degradation of their project site. On a yearly basis, they monitor progress on the project and report back the progress from an ecological recovery perspective across 15 attributes every 5 years and adapt their plan according to what's working and what's not working. We've also put safeguards and guidelines in for biodiversity at all 3 levels of biodiversity: the ecosystemic, the species, and the genetic levels. From a carbon perspective, the standard offers everything you're used to. Financial, environmental, legal additionality. Permanence is insured for 40 years by a buffer pool. It's 20% of all credits, flat and common to all projects. We monitor projects in perpetuity. As long as ERS exists, we will always monitor the permanence of every project that we've ever certified. Leakage is monitored quarterly by satellite imagery and by us. And all credits, to avoid double counting, are registered on a third-party registry. We work with APX from Expansive. The third pillar is livelihoods. Of course, we ask that projects have free, prior, and informed consent from local communities, but we don't stop there. It's really important to us that the stakeholders' needs and aspirations are integrated not just at the start, but throughout the project. So project activities the result of project activities are measured on an annual basis, and the communities are consulted again at least every 5 years to adjust the plans in order to make sure that the projects work for everyone throughout the project lifetime. And finally, transparency is key to driving more finance to the ground. We mandate that project budgets and benefit sharing be shared on the registry so that that information is public to everyone. The certification process is a 5-step process. Feasibility study and an assessment are conducted by the ERS certification team. Once the project developer has passed both of those steps, a third-party independent auditor accredited by ERS will go to the ground to validate that the information given in the assessment is in fact correct and that the project can begin its issuance period. Thereafter, on a quarterly basis, we'll do some monitoring using digital MRV tools like satellite imagery and an app that we give to the project developer. And on an annual basis, we'll get reporting back from the project developers. Those reportings will be shared on an annual basis on the registry for everybody to see. At least every 5 years, but as often as every year if the project developers would like this to happen, the independent auditors will come to verify that everything is going well. When the auditors come to verify, they will be in charge of issuing VRUs. So the issuance mechanism that we've developed is a 2-unit system. At the validation audit, projected restoration units are unlocked. These represent a future sequestration according to calculations that we've done. They're issued at the project start and they cannot be retired. These are not ex ante units. These are forward representations of ownership in a project that will turn into verified units once an auditor has come to the ground and verified that everything is okay, the trees have grown and sequestered the carbon. VRUs can be retired. They're again converted once the auditor verifies that the climate impact has taken place. Last thing I want to talk to you about before we move on to the roundtable discussion is our coalition. The purpose of our coalition is to facilitate direct cooperation between project developers and funders and to send demand signals to both project developers and funders to reassure them about ERS as a standard. This coalition has several advantages for funders who would like to join it. Number one, monthly meetings with a dedicated ERS representative to give you updates on the standard and the pipeline of projects. that are undergoing certification. Second, direct introductions to project developers other funders in the coalition. And third, an inclusion in working groups to shape the future of the ERS standard. It's important here to note that we are not a broker. We do not broker trades. We are a certification standard. We just certify the projects. But through this coalition, we are able to put members of the coalition, funders and project developers alike, in contact with each other if they so wish. If you'd like to learn more, please book a meeting with our external relations team. There'll be a link popping up in the chat to do that. Now on to part two, the roundtable discussion, to put the standard into a broader market context and tackle some key topics on the voluntary carbon markets. For today's roundtable discussions, we're going to cover three topics: the shift in demand from reductions to removals, how the market is rethinking co-benefits, and technology and its limitations. Ellen, Naomi, Julia, it's a pleasure to have you back. Oh, there we go. So to start off, I've got a quick question for Ellen. We talk about reductions and removals as often being pitted against each other. Do you think there's room for both?
Thanks, Thibaut. That's a good question and something we've thought a lot about at AIDA. And actually, for a number of years, it's been something that's cropped up a lot in the market and in conversations we've been having. I would agree with the way you've sort of framed that, with removals and reductions in some ways being pitted against each other. And I think it's less, in some ways, it's less that that's what's actually happening, but it's more the way that things are being interpreted, if that makes sense. So I'll explain that a little bit more. So I would say we see a lot of emphasis on removals, particularly in some contexts. I would say some of the corporate guidance that has come out over the past, recent years has really emphasized the role of removals. And this is kind of a genuine and real thing, right? Removals do have a very specific and very important role to play on the path to net zero. So it's important to emphasize that. I think where the sort of interpretation part comes in is that there's a concern that the way that emphasis on removals is being interpreted, perhaps by some corporates, is that these companies might then overall prioritize removal credits over reductions credits because of the emphasis that they're seeing in the guidance. And that's sort of the way they sort of take that guidance away, is to think that removals are sort of the be all and end all, and that they should actually be prioritized over reduction credits. I think maybe just to step back a bit and provide some of the context about a previous conversation that we had in the setting up of this panel. When we're talking about reductions here, at least in my mind, I'm thinking about a particular subset of reduction activities that are sometimes referred to as avoided emissions, specifically in the context of this webinar and the work that you're doing at ERS, talking about conservation, protecting forests. So when we had our initial conversation in advance of this panel, we had initially used the term avoidance or avoided emissions to frame this question. But I think the problem with that is that the term avoidance can often raise other questions, and in some contexts, it's been watered down a little bit. And so we thought that it was important to emphasize that forest conservation is really a subset of emissions reductions. So anyway, just wanted to get that out there. But back to the question, absolutely, there's room for both. We definitely need both. I started to describe this earlier, but removals do have a very specific and critical role to play on the path to net zero. And as we're making our way closer to 2050, they're going to become all the more essential. And I think where the urgency comes in, and what we're seeing in the guidance and why we feel that urgency around removals and supporting removals today, is that in order to reach the scale and maturity of removals, I think especially when we're talking about technological removals like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, we need that finance flowing now in order to reach the scale, in order to reach the maturity in 2050. We can't sort of just sit back and think that these things are going to appear once we need them. So that's where the urgency comes from when we're talking about removals. I think the urgency when we're talking about reductions, and specifically when we're talking about forest conservation, is a slightly different kind of urgency. And this comes from the fact that if we're not protecting the forests that are standing today, they might not be there tomorrow. So that's, I mean, that feels like to me a little bit of a different level of urgency there. And once they're gone, that might be it. I think certainly in the context of net zero and reducing our emissions in advance of that. So you might have heard before the term irrecoverable carbon. This is referring to the stores of carbon in nature, natural systems within our forests that may be released by human activity. So it's at risk of being released if they're not protected. If these stores are released, they may not be restored in time for 2050. And so basically it puts us over the tipping point and yeah, that's kind of it. So that's where the urgency comes in, I think, when we're talking about reduction. So definitely need both. There's an urgency to get removals, to scale well before 2050, but there's also an urgency to protect forests now, because I think if we're not doing that, they may not still be there, right? Maybe it's in 5 years, maybe it's in 10 years, but I think it's not a risk that we're willing to take. So yeah, that's my answer to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Like you said, I think there's a clear need for both, and what comes to mind when you're explaining all of this is everything, everywhere, all at once. We need all the solutions we can get, all the solutions we can take. We need to improve all of them over time to make sure that they're delivering what they say they're delivering. But we can't count solutions out yet. We need to do everything and to scale everything. Naomi, there's a lot of talk about engineered removals. What is the role of nature-based removals on the voluntary carbon markets? And just before you go, we're aware that there were some sound issues with Julia's microphone. We're working to get that sorted before she comes back for her next question.
Yeah, thank you. I think, much like this sort of false dichotomy between reductions and removals, we also see a similar false dichotomy between industrial removals and nature-based removals. And I think a lot of people, when they're looking at industrial removals and seeing the possibility of a permanence timeline that's, upwards of 500 or 1,000 years, that obviously looks incredibly compelling, making sure that we're solving the climate crisis, not in the short run only, but also in the long run. The reality is, though, that the problem that we face, much like Ellen described, is one that is much, much more urgent than that. And we really need to be able to change the trajectory that we're on, both not losing the standing forests that we have, but also restoring ecosystems before they're so completely lost and degraded that they can't be restored. And so it is incredibly important that we ensure that there is a market and support for ecosystem-based restoration and removals. And we don't just, try to measure these things from some objective or theoretical perspective and really look at the crisis that's in front of us. And I think oftentimes, especially when we're talking about the entire integrity question right now, it's very easy to get caught up in the perfect. It's very easy to get caught up in the absolute ideal of how things could run. But the reality is that we need to be ensuring that finance flows and that we're able to get these activities going and sustained over time, or we will run out of time. The timeline we're looking at is not 1,000 years or 500 years or 50. It's like the next 20 years. And therefore, we need to work with the best that we have available, knowing that that's going to improve over time, knowing that we can always integrate more science and technology. And yes, we need strong policies that ensure the permanence of issued units, strong buffer systems and insurance mechanisms. But we need to recognize that even those shorter term removals are incredibly important to the long-term solution.
Completely agreed. And I think the growing around dynamic accounting of carbon credits, horizontal stacking, these are really important discussions that we could probably set up an entire webinar to discuss that address the reality of it, is rather than assuming that a carbon credit is permanent because it was purchased, in tracking the permanence of every issued unit, not for the issuance period, but forever, and canceling that credit once it no longer exists and replacing it. So there's a lot of really great people starting to push that narrative as well, and I'm excited to see where it goes. The second focus we wanted to talk about today was rethinking co-benefits. Good nature-based projects need to consider biodiversity, local communities, I think this is clearly no longer optional. Naomi, how do you see monitoring of those co-benefits evolving over the next, let's say, 5 years? We know we need to change our approach to co-benefits, but how do you view the monitoring piece of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting one, particularly as we look at some of the evolutions that we see in the science and technology side, and the ability to do more and more of our monitoring remotely with less and less field visits, at least on the technical side. I think when it comes to the social side, however, and the additional benefits side of things, that becomes obviously much more challenging. And I think it's really important in the long run that we figure out, ways that we can streamline the monitoring and verification of activities without losing the connection to people. And in this entire system, I think there's been a lot of evolution of thinking, people coming on board saying, well, I've got this latest satellite technology and we're going to be able to do everything remote and we don't even need to go to the field and everything is going to be great and it's going to be more transparent. But the reality is that's not the case when it comes to the engagement with communities. And we cannot forget that side of things. These are not just empty lands that no one exists on, right? We need to be ensuring the coordination with communities, harmonization with communities. And I think the other big part of this is that, when we talk about FPIC and free, prior, and informed consent, I would almost change that acronym to FPOIC, free, prior, informed, and ongoing consent. And I think that that's a big element of the shift that we need to see in the monitoring. But even that word feels slightly wrong when we're talking about communities and social impacts and things, right? It's really about a coordinated effort on the ground to collaborate with partners who over time are a part of the actual solution that is delivering restoration benefits, delivering and protecting forests, and viewing those communities as essential to the core operation of the project. They aren't co-actors, they aren't beneficiaries, they aren't people that we go monitor, right? That also has a sort of big brotherish element to it, right? We need to shift to a much more partnership related model that works with them on the ground and that we have that ongoing contact with, including for ensuring that those benefits and activities that are meant to be integrated are happening as they should, as they've been discussed with communities, and continue to serve their needs.
I could not agree more. And to jump on that, the inclusion of traditional community knowledge in the success of many of these projects is abundantly clear if you spend any time with projects on the ground, with well-meaning organizations who've come into a place and said, let's do this. We're going to do these trees. We're going to plant them this way, and then 3 years later, 70% of the trees are dead because nobody told them that the goats go graze there, and that there needs to be an adaptive plan around what are we going to do around the coast. So that local knowledge is absolutely key. And when you talk to local communities, it becomes very clear that they're keenly aware of both the ecosystems that are around them and what's needed to bring them back, and engaging them as partners makes sense at every level. Ellen, I wanted to dive a little deeper here on, we talked about communities and livelihoods, but we can also talk a little bit about biodiversity. And I think when we talk about carbon biodiversity right now, the thought that comes up is biodiversity credits. We've had a lot of noise around biodiversity credits in the last year and since COP15. Is it hype? Is it here to stay? Will it stack in with carbon credits? Will they become their own market? What are your thoughts in that general biodiversity credits field?
Thanks, Thibaut. That's a good question. I mean, what I can definitely say with confidence is there is a lot of talk about biodiversity credits. I don't think anyone can question that. We're hearing that a lot at AIDA, and it's been really interesting to see how quickly things are evolving, how many new sort of initiatives and new standards are cropping up. But also, I mean, from AIDA's perspective, because our interest, certainly historically, but I mean, with no question going forward, is very much on carbon credits and emissions trading mechanisms. Pardon me. It's been interesting to see how many players within the carbon market are also sort of entering this new arena, I guess, of biodiversity credits specifically. And I think it's probably not surprising given, at the risk of using the term co-benefits, which I completely agree with Julia's statement around it sort of framing things like it's a cherry on top when actually it should be an incredibly sort of core and central piece of carbon markets. But because of all those kind of additional activities that have been ongoing in the carbon market with Vera's CCB and, ART is also developing what they're calling a co-benefit certification initiative. So I think, it's been a longstanding part of carbon markets. And so it's interesting to see biodiversity sort of spin off in a way in its own thing. I think from AIDA's view, there's, clearly an interest in the biodiversity space in using these market mechanisms and crediting systems that we have been seeing for a long time being used for carbon. I think, to the extent that we can leverage some of the best practices and lessons learned from the carbon market and share that with these kind of new developing mechanisms for biodiversity, I think it's important that we do that. It does feel maybe it's just my own sort of sentiment. It does, in some ways, it feels too early to say where this market is headed. Julia organized a really interesting session as a part of her work with the NCSA on biodiversity credits and markets, and it was amazing to see, all the different activities that are happening. But I think one of my big takeaways from that session too was just how nascent a lot of these conversations are, which is quite interesting. So I do hesitate to say where exactly it is headed, whether it remains a standalone market or whether it sort of becomes something that's stacked into carbon markets. From where we stand at AIDA, I think it's really important that carbon markets and biodiversity markets aren't operating entirely in separate silos, though. And I think, to the extent that we can try and prevent that from happening and sort of bring these conversations together, we will try to do that. And I think it helps that a lot of our members, are involved in both and kind of helps align both of these topics a little bit. So we are feeling like there's a bit of a natural convergence happening here. If I can maybe if that could be my answer of whether it becomes a standalone thing or stacking, I think there's a natural convergence, and I think maybe I'll leave it at that, and we'll see what that ends up looking like, if it is a sort of a stacking mechanism or something else.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the drivers of both climate change and biodiversity loss and their similarities, it's a twin crisis, right? Of biodiversity loss and climate change, and it makes sense to have solutions that are on some level interwoven or at least compatible as we start to move forward.
If I can just very quickly add to that, Thibaut,
Yeah,
because I meant to say it
go for
earlier,
it.
but
We've got
just
time.
because
We're early.
okay, great. It popped into my head, and it's because it was a conversation that we had yesterday in one of our member meetings at AIDA. So I won't attribute it to anyone because those meetings aren't public. But one of our members, I thought, put this really well, and they were talking about natural climate solutions and biodiversity, and so when it comes to natural climate, there are so many different and very important facets that you're working with, even if you're kind of in it for the carbon. There's the carbon aspect, but there's also the community impacts. There's the biodiversity. I mean, just to name a few of the important benefits. And what they were saying is, if you're only looking at and prioritizing one of these and sort of making decisions based on a positive outcome, just based on one of those facets, you're probably not actually ultimately making the best decision that's going to result in a good outcome on all of those. And so it's really important that you're looking at all of those and making decisions based on all of those different facets. And so I think, yeah, in some ways that answers the question too, right? Like these can't all be separate. We have to be thinking about this holistically, which is, ultimately what you were saying, but just wanted to reiterate that.
No, I think you reiterated much better than I ever have. So thank you for that. And then I think from us as a Stanford point of view, that's why we decided to go for a pillars approach as opposed to a carbon standard with co-benefits. We felt like it was too important to have as something that was optional, as something that was separate. We felt the need to place the bar at this is what every project should look like, and so I think very aligned in that regard. The third topic that we wanted to dive into was related a little bit to Naomi's answer regarding co-benefits and how we monitor them. Like Naomi mentioned the increasing use of technology in monitoring projects in general, and that seems to be a key trend we've been seeing in the last few years. We've heard the word DMRV, digital MRV, thrown around quite a bit. Ellen, just to start us off, could you maybe give us an idea of what a DMRV or digital MRV is? Could you start to give us a bit of a lay of the land? We know it means digital monitoring, reporting, verification, but what does that mean?
Yeah, thanks, Thibaut. Appreciate that, and happy to start this conversation off. And certainly admit I'm not an expert, so we'll look forward to others' remarks. But yeah, certainly happy to kick it off. So I would say digital monitoring, reporting, and verification is in many ways very much what it sounds like. It's basically the digitization or the use of digital technology to fulfill your MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification requirements. And I thought the easiest way to describe that was a couple of examples. So for example, for monitoring, it's instead of having multiple, maybe like on-site visits where the only way to monitor a project was to send people on the ground, sort of take a look at what's happening with physical people being in a certain place at a certain time. You can use satellites, for example, right? So that's kind of a basic example of using digital technology for monitoring. I think another area that we're seeing a lot of use of technology and automation is using sort of AI, so to automate some of the processes that had previously been a manual process or analog process. We're also seeing an increase in blockchain technologies as well for issuance and verification. So yeah, I think just quickly, just to give our quick AIDA perspective on that, I think at a really high level, I mean, obviously these technological advances are incredibly important, and I think they're going to be important to help get to the scale that we need and help sort of level up the market in that way. But it doesn't mean that that's sort of the be all and end all solution. And so going forward, I think having, that important combination of both boots on the ground, people, sort of double checking things is going to be really important while we also leverage this, the new technology that we're seeing in the market as well.
Yeah, digital MRV is a necessary step forward, the digitalization of a system that was mostly paper-based analog, but it's not a panacea. We still need VDBs on the ground because there's a lot of stuff that you can't check with satellite imaging. Naomi, how do you think the use of these new technologies was going to impact project developers?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, from a project development and investment perspective, I think it's a really interesting world at the moment because there are so many new technologies and approaches available. It can feel, you want to start to leverage those in particular to invest in, higher integrity, higher quality, more transparent projects. And so on the one hand, it can be very exciting to, consider how you might integrate some of the new technology. And on the other hand, you also need to be making sure that it's going to actually deliver something that is more high quality and delivers on that goal, right? It's not just technology for technology's sake. It's technology that actually delivers something that, when you take into account the cost benefit, has a significant enough value in addition to the older approaches that it's worth investing in. And I think, there's also a number of other technologies that have come online that, while they're great and may in the long run provide a lot of really innovative opportunity, they don't currently align with what is required by the standards. So for example, there's a lot of work going on to be able to do direct above ground biomass measurement, or to even directly measure the flux of carbon in a particular landscape. And those are definitely, to some degree or another, depending on the technology, depending on the uncertainty, depending on how appropriate they are for specific landscapes and the density of measurement and et cetera. Some could be utilized now, and some may be very far away from being operational within the context of carbon markets and what needs to be delivered for the accounting for projects. And so at the moment, there's sort of a tidal wave of ideas and potential. And I think there's going to need to be a bit of a coalescence around which technologies actually make sense. How do we best implement them? Do they really provide a cost benefit that is above and beyond what we've seen before? And are we actually ending up with something that's more transparent? If you don't have sufficient ground truthing, is it actually accurate enough where you are? And is that accuracy and uncertainty quantified in a way that is transparent? And are, you know, the models and AI functions that sit behind some of these things and deliver a result actually more accurate than what has been used? So I think there is a lot of potential. There is a lot that can be incorporated now and will be incorporated over the next number of years. It's a never-ending thing, technological innovation. So we always need to be open to figuring out how to do that, but we need to do it in a way that actually drives value rather than adds additional cost to the process without actually delivering something more quality.
Super interesting. And I think what you said about landscapes, the different use of these technologies, even across different landscapes, when we look at the work we did over the last 12 months, one of the things we did was remove from our scope mangroves. We'll be building a dedicated methodology for that. And the simple reason is when we looked at the above ground biomass models that we were training, we were using, the data that was going into them, very few, if any of them, were ground truthing models on mangroves. And if they were only looking at above ground biomass, and the assumptions for below ground biomass and soil organic carbon were more or less standardized based on what was in the literature. But when you look deeper into the literature, you figure out, well, soil organic carbon varies widely from week to week on the same site, let alone across different sites, even if they're in the same country. And we really didn't feel comfortable with those levels of uncertainty across those landscapes. And although I think we're the first to say we need to start restoring mangroves, I think Southeast Asia alone has 400,000 hectares of degraded mangroves, areas that are abandoned from mostly intensive aquaculture. These are areas that nobody's doing anything with. It's non-competitive with any other human activity. We could be restoring them, but there is that limit, right? How do we know how much impact this is going to deliver? And before we test or even estimate, we need to have a little bit more certainty. And so having that nuance, ecosystem by ecosystem, is crucially important. And even deeper within forest ecosystem, inland forest ecosystems, the levels of uncertainty in, say, tropical drylands vary massively from boreal forests. The assumption that you make for how open a canopy is on your allometric equations can 100%, 200 can be 100%, 200% just based on assumptions that you're making. And so it's really important to get that right. It's really important to benchmark against reliable ground truthing. And it's really important to I think, publish both those benchmarks and the uncertainties. And I think as we gear up to having more digital MRV, that's something we need to consider.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just respond quickly to that, I think this is one of the fundamental challenges in the market right now is this balance between workability and accuracy, and how do we build in opportunities for continuous improvement, because the technology is always going to get better and end up having more and more refined systems that probably can pick up more and more of that with remote sensing, especially when we're building in some of the machine learning that could, you know, with more scientific work to look at how we measure and monitor some of those site-specific issues. You know, over time, we're building up a global system that will improve significantly. And yet, you know, mangroves are super critical ecosystem, particularly when we're talking about the impact of climate change. And they're one of the best protectors of, you know, inland areas close to coastal areas. And so it is really essential that we bring those mangroves into the system as quickly as possible. And does that mean we just wait for the science and the remote sensing to be perfect? Or does it mean, you know, we sort of have a good sense of quantifying the uncertainty? Maybe we discount against that uncertainty so that we're fairly certain of what is being credited, and yet we're able to let that finance flow earlier than waiting for, you know, for something to reach a much higher level of uncertainty. And I think this is it is a challenging problem. And it's a challenging problem, particularly in the context of a lot of scrutiny around the quality of accounting. We don't have time for everything to be perfect, and yet we need it to be clear, we need it to be transparent, we need it to be robust, and we need to ensure that a ton is a ton. And that is not an easy thing to do right now.
And we have a few more minutes before we need to get to Q&A, so just to bounce one more time off of that, I think one of the things you mentioned is uncertainties. And the nice thing about uncertainties is if they're we might have large uncertainties, but if we have a good idea and a relatively exhaustive set of uncertainties and we're able to quantify those, we know that in all likelihood, the value falls somewhere in between the uncertainty bounds. Right? We often see a calculation as saying, the above ground biomass for this ecosystem, for this landscape is X number. Actually, that number is typically the 50th percentile between an error range. It could be between this value and this value. We're at a, say, 95% confidence interval. We're very confident it falls between 100 and 150 or 100 and 200. And so that the displayed number will be, say, 125, right? Between 100 and 150. And if we say, well, we think that the uncertainty is so large that perhaps we should discount against that. A practical way to do this might be to say, instead of picking the 50th percentile, why don't we pick the 33rd percentile, the 25th percentile? And we are de facto conservative. On average, we know we fall within the right range. And on average, we know we are under-crediting, average over-crediting. And so if we're doing this well and we're doing this systematically, then on average, we have a system that works, even though specifically we might be wrong. And I think that could be an approach that works. Okay. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I think a lot of panels often go a little bit high level. I hope we didn't lose too many people as we got into the weeds. But I think this is also where a lot of the decisions need to happen. And it's important to give people context of the nuance and the difficulty of making some of these decisions. Before we turn off this webinar, we want to turn to some questions from the audience. Would it be possible to have some questions from the audience, either put in the chat? Alrighty. So let's see what we have here. There we go. A lot of comments and people introducing themselves. I'm looking.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I just
There you go.
maybe in our
Go for
some
it.
questions.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. All right. So we have one question from Garth. How can incremental carbon capture in arable land without land use change be economically policed permanently? It's a really good question. I think when we look at the carbon credit, so when you look at the land that we can do restoration on, because this is what this standard that we're building is for, you have roughly about 2 billion hectares of degraded land. Half of that, more or less, is competitive with agriculture. It's on land that is arable. The other half isn't competitive with agriculture. It's on land that's not arable. So you have a massive pipeline of landscapes and potential projects that can be done without competition to arable land. That's the first part. The second part is on landscapes that are competitive in some respect with arable land. The best projects we've seen improve the agriculture in or around the project so that the food security increases while leaving enough space for the project. I'll give you an example. We were in Costa Rica looking at a project that is creating a biodiversity corridor between two national parks on an altitude gradient to enable species to migrate as climate change comes in. Beautiful, fantastic project. What they're doing is they're working with farmers to say, we're going to set aside 10, 20% of your land to create this corridor. In exchange, we will finance better equipment, training for more sustainable agricultural practices that are also higher yield. And what they found, and this was actually in ranching, and so it's they do grazing in a rotational way, and so the farmers get 30% better yield, and they lose 20% of their land. The math works out for them in the very long term. Like, this is beneficial for them. The other thing is, in a lot of cases, on land that is or even isn't competitive with arable land, you have a need from communities to restore the ecosystemic benefits associated with the landscape. I'll give you another example. We're in Kenya looking at projects, and the mayor was telling us that in his community, there was significant drought and much higher than previously. And they had talked to experts, and it seemed to be linked to the fact that the different hills and mountains had been deforested. And so the water from rainfall was no longer making its way into aquifers. The land had become very packed, it was no longer absorbing any water. And so the aquifers were drying up. The wells were drying up. And that mayor said, we have an emergency here that is a water emergency. And the only way we can fix it, the best way we can fix it, is by restoring our ecosystem and restoring that ability to fill those aquifers using these natural ecosystems. And so here it's something that, yes, it might be competitive with agriculture, but if you're in a landscape and there is no more water, that agriculture isn't enough to sustain the local communities and the constituency that this mayor was in charge of. So I think that's something to note. Naomi, Ellen, Julia, do you have anything do you want to jump on this question as well? No? All righty. I've got another one for you. Go for it, Ellen. You're saying?
Just saying, I think you covered it.
Okay, sounds good. Why should social and biodiversity benefits be included if not paid for as additional? If the task is to reduce carbon emissions or increase sequestration, 1 ton carbon of an exotic plantation is the same as 1 ton of a primary forest in terms of climate response. Who wants to take this one? I would say here, end of life is not considered in today's standard, at least that I know of. So if you have a commercial plantation that's used for pulp and paper, and you're assuming that that's permanent, I might say, where does that pulp and paper go? And does it finish in landfill or incinerated? If so, permanent question mark. But Naomi, Ellen, anybody want to try to tackle this one? Julia? Sorry, your mic is not working, Julia, unfortunately. It's frustrating because I know you have good things to say here. Yeah.
I can jump in, I suppose. I think it is really important to value all of the impacts that come with these projects. And, oftentimes there are, as we were talking about earlier, whether it's biodiversity or community or, very intended sustainable development efforts that are a big part of the core aspects of the project that add value. And I think there are a number of different approaches out there to how one assesses and talks about those benefits. But at the moment, we don't really have a market that values them independently. And I think this is part of the question of what will be the ultimate answer on biodiversity credits and whether they're stacked or whether they're a separate asset. At the moment, we don't have a separate market, right? This market has focused on carbon because that is the thing that is being measured and traded. Whereas there isn't an independent source of demand for some of those other outcomes. And so we have to consider, how do we build the demand side for some of the other benefits beyond just something nice to have in a project, right? I think a lot of buyers, particularly in the voluntary market, want to purchase credits with those additional values, because it helps them also meet other CSR goals. But that doesn't mean they need to purchase a certain unit that either counts against their footprint and or is some kind of contribution, right? We don't yet have that articulated demand side vision for those things. And so I think a lot of the answer on, where our biodiversity credit is going to go is going to rely on that as well. Is it something that adds value? Is it something there's an independent demand for? Or are these just holistic projects that need to include these things? And that doesn't mean that the latter doesn't have a financial value, right? We could get to a point where those projects that have the most compelling additional benefits, those projects that have biodiversity impacts, have a higher price because they're rated higher, or they have some sort of additional designation under ICVCM or something along those lines, right? So there's different ways to think about that. But I think at the moment, the market demand comes for the carbon, and that's why we don't see enough additional revenue for some of those other components in some cases.
I would, largely agree with that. And I sort of articulating that the demand kind of issue, I guess, is really important. Where is the demand coming from for things beyond carbon? It's not always clear. But as you said, and maybe I'm really just sort of reiterating, but what we hear from a lot of our members, I think, is kind of hope. And when you're referencing ICVCM and other sort of, integrity initiatives, I think there's hope from a lot of the members that I talk to about getting to a place in the market where, even if there isn't sort of like a specific unique mechanism to value, some of the other, biodiversity and social benefits that come from carbon, at least the market will hopefully get to a place where buyers are willing to pay a premium for the credits, where you can really see the measurement of these benefits. So I mean, that's what I would say. So I maybe just to say too, not to push back overly on this question, but I don't know that anyone's saying that that social and biodiversity benefits should be included and not paid for. I think, Naomi, you and I agree, and I don't want to speak for Julia, but I'm sure you would too, would agree that it's important that these are paid for, right? They are an additional value as a part of a carbon credit. And so, the hope is that the market gets to a place where people just pay more for a credit where they're seeing that social and biodiversity benefit.
Super clear. I think that's a great way to wrap this up. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Please don't forget to check out our website, our guests on LinkedIn, to make sure to follow them. I believe Naomi and Integrity Global Partners, as well as ERS, will be at the CIFB conference in London in early October. So please come say hi. I believe a lot of people, I know Julia is on 7 different panels at I don't know if it's 7, but she's on a lot of panels in New York. 1. Okay, good for you. So you gotta follow. So make sure to say hi in New York as well. We'll be there as well at the NACS conference. But CEM is hosting a fantastic conference in October as well. Please make sure to go check that out. If you want to reach out to our team, if we didn't get to answer your questions, we're going to put a link now of different email addresses, LinkedIn's. We'll try to answer any of your questions after this. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you all for joining, and thank you very much to our guests for participating. It was a lovely and thorough conversation, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Bye, everyone.